watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
I now have the pleasure of sitting with Hillel Neuer, who is the head of UN Watch. And you know what? I should let you explain what what UN Watch is.
We're a non-governmental organization based in Geneva, Switzerland, whose mission is to monitor the United Nations according to the principles of its charter. So we're a group that believes in the founding principles of the United Nations to put an end to the scourge of war, to promote human rights. And regrettably, too often, those are distorted, those principles. And our job is to uphold them and to try to make it work as the founders envisioned.
How did a nice Jewish boy from Canada end up in Geneva?
Wrong turn, actually. I thought it was New York, so I got off the ship. No, it's the kind of work that we do, which is fighting anti-Semitism, anti-Israel bias, but also promoting human rights and promoting international law as it was envisioned by Eleanor Roosevelt, is the kind of issues I was always interested in dealing with from a young age: politics, law, Israel, human rights. And so the short answer is it's what I always wanted to do, more or less.
That's lovely.
And the long answer is I spent 10 years in university studying law and politics and did some writing on these issues. So I gravitated toward it and practiced law for a few years in New York as a litigator, and eventually made the transition.
Very nice. So here you are at APAC, and the subject of your panel that you were on really had to do with the worldwide attempt to delegitimize Israel. And the way it was presented in the packet, in the folder, one of the things you were going to discuss was what are we doing to re-legitimize the state of Israel? First of all, Hillel, we've talked about this an awful lot on Shalom TV, but I still want your thumbnail summary. At the moment, how bad is it? What are the worst examples of the way in which Israel is under assault by those who we delegitimize and basically argue that there should not be a state of Israel?
Well, it's quite tragic and really a twist of fate that the very body that gave Israel its birth certificate on November 29, 1947, the partition plan, calling for a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. If the Palestinians and the Arabs had accepted the compromise proposal of the United Nations back in 1947, today we would be celebrating not only the 63rd anniversary of the State of Israel, we'd be celebrating the anniversary, the 63rd anniversary of the Palestinian state. And regrettably, they refused to accept compromise, and they chose war and fought a war of aggression. But the United Nations was the one who proposed and recommended the creation of a Jewish state. And it's important to remember that resolution not only calls for a Jewish state, it mentions the words Jewish state 30 times. Now, the Palestinians today in the Arab world are refusing to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, and that's seen as a point of dispute. The United Nations itself, 1947, used that term 30 times in recommending it. Now, how did a body like that go from the situation today? And what is the situation today? At the Parliament of the UN, which is the General Assembly in New York, there are 20 resolutions every year against Israel. All of them one-sided, say nothing about Iran, say nothing about Iran's role in funding Hamas and Hezbollah terrorism, nothing about Fatah and their associates that support terrorism, the incitement that we're seeing, the education of Palestinian children to hatred. There's none of that mentioned. It's all attacking Israel. There's a handful of resolutions on other countries. So that's in New York. In Geneva, where I am, at the Human Rights Council, which has a lot of symbolic value for people because human rights is our new religion, as Professor Erwin Kotler, my mentor, has said, in our day and age, for many, human rights is the new religion. So the Human Rights Council of the UN carries a lot of symbolism. Indeed, it was founded in its origin by Eleanor Roosevelt, founded the Human Rights Commission. So it had the right ideals, the right vision. What happened? Well, it got hijacked. The members you'll see around the table today are not Eleanor Roosevelt. They're not René Cassin of France. They are instead members include Russia, China, Cuba, Pakistan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia is a member. Last year, Libya, the dictatorship of Muammar Gaddafi, was elected a member of the Human Rights Council. It is outrageous, it is absurd, it is Orwellian. George Orwell could not have imagined this. What do they do at the Human Rights Council? Well, the vast majority of the world's worst abusers never get addressed in any shape or form. They get a free pass, they get impunity. Hamas gets impunity. Immunity. Instead, to a large degree, the Human Rights Council focuses most of its attention on Israel. There have been about 60 resolutions dealing with countries, criticizing countries, 2/3 of those, 40 out of 60 on Israel. This is a country which is a tiny dot on the world map, happens to be a liberal democracy with a free press, an independent judiciary, a place where you can replace leader by electoral democracy, something which is absent in the rest of the Middle East. And instead, this is the country that bears the brunt of so much attention of the Human Rights Council. We have an agenda which goes through 10 different agenda items at every meeting, a permanent agenda item. There's one agenda item for 192 countries, the whole world, and then one agenda item just for Israel alone. So Israel is singled out permanently, institutionally, at every single meeting of the United Nations.
Why? Hillel, why? You've described the situation. What do you imagine is behind this extraordinary attempt to vilify Israel?
Well, the immediate protagonists in this campaign to assault Israel diplomatically, it's indeed war by other means. It's war in the diplomatic arena. It's to demonize Israel, to strip it of any legitimacy. The immediate protagonists are the Arab countries and the Islamic states. They're the ones who introduce most of the resolutions. Sometimes the EU does a few, but mostly it's the Islamic and Arab states pushing this campaign. They have an automatic majority of dictatorships. China, Russia, Cuba, they're not Islamic, they're not Arab, but they vote with the dictatorships automatically. And then, sadly, we get a number of democracies like India, like South Africa, like Brazil, which are part of the developing world, and for a variety of reasons position themselves as anti-Western and vote for every anti-Israel resolution, even though a country like India has very good relations with Israel economically, bilaterally, but at the United Nations they vote for every one-sided resolution. So that is the immediate situation. Unfortunately, to a large degree, European countries often go along. Sometimes, rarely, they vote no. Often they abstain. In other cases, they vote yes. They go along with the Arab states. Now, why do they go along? Well, the Arab states have oil. That speaks volumes. We know that up until a few months ago, no one would say anything about Gaddafi. Not British, not the French, not even America. Actually, they were doing oil deals with Gaddafi. Same goes for Saudi Arabia. Oil buys you a free pass, even though you're one of the world's worst human rights abusers at the United Nations. I believe there's also UN votes. There are 56 Islamic votes at the UN. There's one state for the Jewish vote. So 56-1. Everything at the UN is vote trading. You vote for me on my issue, I'll vote for you. You're going to get 56 Islamic votes. You could be some country in Latin America or in Asia. You don't care about Jews or anything, but you're going to get 56 votes for your pet issue. You'll go with them. And I think this explains a lot. At the same time, let's be honest, there are also psychological factors. There are factors that are not only realpolitik. There are irrational factors at work, and it seems that some countries, including some European countries, seem to be comfortable with constantly scapegoating Israel. Now, some have said that this is a result of European countries feeling guilty about what they did or didn't do during the Holocaust. And if Israel can now be a war criminal, Israel is an occupier, then their own record, somehow they feel that a certain catharsis for their own acts. And there's a lot of theories about that. But we know who the players are, and it's a difficult challenge.
To any extent, is this veiled anti-Semitism?
Well, certainly the effects are anti-Semitic. We've seen how the UN attack on Israel is cited by those who will physically attack Jewish people. We saw it during the Operation Cast Lead in the beginning of 2009 in Europe. Immediately there were attacks on Jewish communities, and often the UN decisions create a sense, an aura of legitimacy that the world is against Israel. So if you are a Muslim extremist on the suburbs of Paris, and you may have extreme views, if you feel the world is with you, that's an extra boost to go out there and commit a violent act. And so clearly the demonization of Israel, if we look at the language that's used, it's borrowing on motifs that are classically anti-Semitic. At the same time, I don't think it's a useful argument to make to convince people to change their voting positions. I think one ought to make the case very simply: no double standards. The Human Rights Council was founded on the premise of non-selectivity, no double standards. That's all one should ask for. If you talk about anti-Semitism, people say, oh, there you go again, anti-Semitism. I don't think people have to go there. Let's just have a single standard. Let's treat countries equally, and certainly let's not treat a democracy worse than we treat a dictatorship.
Hillel, I want to understand to what extent is the problem you're describing a symbolic issue, and it should trouble Jews because it's symbolic, and it's a symbolic assault on the state of Israel? To what extent do you worry that this is, as you said before, a form of warfare against Israel which could have serious, practical, deleterious results for the state of Israel?
The effects are real, they're significant, and they're both long-term and short-term. Long-term, we've seen 3 decades of delegitimization of Israel, beginning in 1975, in the famous Zionism is Racism resolution. That launched a campaign that has not ended, and it has steadily eroded Israel's image around the world. We all know, people say, oh, well, Israel violates every UN resolution, and there isn't a journalist in Europe who won't cite that on a regular basis, or diplomats. And that took about 3 decades, and it's become just a fact of life. Israel violates every UN resolution. That's a long-term effect, and it just steadily erodes Israel's legitimacy. If Israel doesn't have friends and allies, it cannot conduct proper diplomatic relations, economic relations, as any country would. You need to have support, you need to have legitimacy. But there are also short-term consequences. Bear in mind, just a year and a half ago, we had the Goldstone report accusing Israel of committing crimes against humanity, accusing Israel of deliberately targeting civilians. And within a short time, you had an arrest warrants issued out of London against Tzipi Livni, the head of Israel's peace camp. Couldn't go to London. Now, what does that mean when Israel's political and military leaders can't fly to a city in Europe? So the effects, and it's no mistake, no accident, that Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu said that Israel was facing several threats. He listed 3, and one of them was delegitimization of Israel. So the impact these days is not only long-term, which is worrying enough, it's short-term as well.
The President of the United States said in an address, both at the State Department and then again as he spoke to AIPAC, that he basically came out very strongly against any attempt by the Palestinians to gain a unilateral declaration of statehood through the United Nations. As one who is observing how the UN works these days, what's your assessment? How real a possibility is that the UN General Assembly will make some kind of declaration of Palestinian statehood in September?
Currently, it seems to be very high. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas published an op-ed in the New York Times and said this is their intention, and how is he going to climb down from that? Now, if Israel would grant some enormous concession, then perhaps they would change their minds. It seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not able to give them what they want. What they want is the end game of the negotiations rather than the beginning. They want Israel to concede up into the 67 lines. Well, what does that mean? That means that includes the old city of Jerusalem. That includes putting communities at risk. And that's not likely. It's contrary to the Bush letter, which talked about leaving established communities that have been created since 1967 as part of Israel. So it doesn't seem possible at this point that Bibi Netanyahu could offer what the Palestinians say they need to climb down from this ladder. It seems as if they've climbed up too high. And at this point, it seems likely that we will get some kind of resolution. What
you're suggesting is the United States does not have enough clout or political capital in the UN to stop this from happening?
That's a good question. In general, in short, the answer is probably not. So if we look at the past couple of years, the administration was not able to stop a resolution on settlements from a couple of weeks ago, which the U.S. vetoed, the first veto, as far as I recall, of the Obama administration at the UN. And even though Obama pleaded with Abu Mazen not to isolate America and put America in that corner, couldn't convince the Palestinians. They had climbed up too high and couldn't climb down. We saw it with the Goldstone report. Initially, the American government and Israel did persuade the Palestinian Authority to delay endorsement of the Goldstone report after it was presented, and then Hamas initiated some kind of a revolt against Abu Mazen and put up his poster and called him a traitor, and then 2 weeks later did a 180 and the UN endorsed the Goldstone report. So the track record of the past couple of years is that on issues of identity issues for the Palestinians, things that they've feel they need to appease the anti-Israel sentiment of the street, of the radicals, America does not have influence. Now, America does have a veto at the Security Council, and that could prevent the UN from admitting a member state called Palestine, but they do not have a veto over the General Assembly, which could declare their support for a state. They could recognize a state.
It was the General Assembly, by the way, which created the State of Israel, not the Security Council.
Well, that is correct. The General Assembly recommended the partition plan, and Israel used that as a birth certificate. And it was the General Assembly that admitted Israel as a member state based on the recommendation of the Security Council. So to admit a country as a member state to the UN, you need the Security Council recommendation.
By the way, I want to make clear, in 47 when the UN vote occurred, then in 48 when Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel, the UN still did not recognize or admit Israel into the United Nations. My recollection is that happened in 1949. Am I right?
Yes. Well, it was fairly recently in terms of UN terms. That is correct. 1947, November 29th was the recommendation for the partition plan. On that basis, Israel declared a state. The Arabs launched a war, and by 1949, the UN acknowledged Israel as a peace-loving state and admitted them.
So it seems to me that what you're suggesting is it is conceivable that the General Assembly could take a vote for a Palestinian state, even if the Security Council did not issue some kind of invitation or recommendation to admit this Palestinian state into a formal membership in the UN.
That's right. I would distinguish between two separate things. One is a declaration that we recognize a Palestinian state, endorse a Palestinian state, and that's just declaratory and would not necessarily change the status of the Palestinian representative at the UN, who currently enjoys many of the privileges of a UN member state, except they're seated as an observer along with the Vatican in the back, but otherwise is treated in almost every other respect. They don't vote, but they can introduce resolutions. So the GA could certainly declare whatever they want to.
And you're predicting that they will do this in September?
Every indication at this time is yes. We hope they'll be persuaded otherwise. And if that's not the case, we hope that a moral majority will be formed. And that's key. It means we need to have the United States and leading democracies saying that anything that subverts and undermines and seeks to bypass the bilateral negotiations. There is a peace process. It may not be very active right now, but there are Oslo Accords. They were signed solemnly, witnessed by the U.S., the European Union, and others. And the Palestinians have no right to circumvent the negotiations. Any attempt for unilateral declaration of a state spells a death knell for the negotiations, and that could hurt the Palestinians too. Europeans need to understand that they need to be on board. So even if they get the declaration, if they don't have the moral majority, that will defeat, I think, their symbolic purpose.
So is it, how shall I say this, is it not so bad if it happens? In other words, how bad is it for Israel if the General Assembly recognizes the Palestinian state?
I don't think it's necessarily the end of the world, and let's recall the General Assembly said that in a resolution declared that Zionism was racism in 1975. Let's remember that in 2004 the General Assembly had referred a case to the World Court advisory opinion. They ruled that Israel's security barrier was contrary to international law. The barrier is still there, and Zionism still exists even though it was declared to be racist.
That was repealed.
It was indeed repealed in 1991, that's correct. And there are a host of UN resolutions that declare Israel's presence in Jerusalem to be in violation, Israel's presence in the Golan Heights, and life continues. So the fact that a GA declares something does not mean the end of the world. That said, it's a symbolic flag. It's waving a flag, and it's really a measure of how many countries vote for it. So even if the consequence the next day might not necessarily be creating a state at the UN, a member state at the UN, the symbolic act of the world voting against Israel, whatever would be in the text, the text could be mild, but just a symbolic act, and on an issue that's seen as a core issue, declaring the 67 lines, which of course Abba Eban called the Auschwitz borders for Israel, declaring that to be supported by the international community against Israel's desires, that would be a flag, sort of waving a flag that the world is against Israel, and that could generate all kinds of inflammatory violence, perhaps, in the region. So my concern is that this decision, even if its impact, there's no necessary consequence, it could have the effect of encouraging extremists and I fear even violence.
How significant, if at all, to you is the fact that President Obama, in his speech on Thursday at the State Department, as we're taping, it's last Thursday, did go out of his way to refer to Israel as the Jewish state? And you mentioned that earlier in this discussion, and that at one point, Bibi Netanyahu, in his declaration of commitment to the two-state solution did say there should be a Jewish state of Israel. And there was an uproar, even among some American Jews, who said, why are you injecting the word Jewish into the state of Israel? Now we have a president of the United States going out of his way to call Israel the Jewish state and homeland of the Jewish people. Significant in the context that you work or not?
Well, I think it's welcome and it's important. It's not new for an American president. Certainly President Bush and others use this language. And as I mentioned before, the United Nations partition resolution refers to a Jewish state not once but 30 times. It should not be controversial, and it isn't for people who understand what Israel is all about. The international community, beginning from the Balfour Declaration, which was then endorsed by the League of Nations, called for a homeland for the Jewish people. That there's something that Woodrow Wilson proposed called the right of self-determination. It's a right that's accepted worldwide. The Jewish people have that right of self-determination. They have historic, religious, cultural ties to Israel, and they have a right to their homeland. And just as the Arab states have their right to homeland, the Palestinians, Menachem Begin recognized their legitimate rights. Bibi Netanyahu recognized the right of a Palestinian state, provided that core issues are addressed. And that core issue is you need to acknowledge our existence. And that, I think, boils down to the real issue here, is that we can dispute settlements, and there are people who are friends of Israel, have different views on the settlements, different views on a range of issues. But until the Arab world, the Palestinians and the Arab states, recognize Israel's right to exist under any border, until that happens, until they recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state, there are 56 Islamic states. Why can't there be one Jewish state in the ancient Jewish homeland? And until that's acknowledged, it's hard to see how we can get an agreement and work out the details if that core issue. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu was quite correct to say we need to see that recognition. And so I welcome the fact that President Obama has underscored Israel as a Jewish state and as a Jewish homeland. I also welcome the fact that in his speech he referred to the Palestinian UN resolution as a symbolic act to delegitimize Israel, to isolate Israel, and spoke out against it. So the fact that the American president has done so is important. I hope he'll be able to rally support in European capitals as well to stop something that threatens to undermine the peace process.
All right, so my last question for you is, you spoke today, and one of the responsibilities you had was to make suggestions to the audience as to what individuals can do in the fight against this attempt to delegitimize the state of Israel. We've got many Jews and non-Jews watching you right now all across America and in your home of Canada. Tell them, what do you suggest for us? What should we be doing?
Well, I think people who care about human rights, people who care about the vision of the United Nations, to put an end to the scourge of war, to promote and protect human rights for all people, need, number one, to get informed. And there's a number of ways you can do that. One way is to sign up. UN Watch has a website, unwatch.org, and they can go up there, go at that website, sign up to a newsletter, and get informed about what's happening. We need to know what's going on. Once you know what's going on, there are all kinds of avenues to take action. One is on our website. You can click on the website and send a message to world leaders and show them that you care about a certain issue, and those messages, when there are thousands of people, add up and are cumulative and have an impact. I think people can educate their audiences, whether you're a student in university, whether you're a reader of a newspaper. There's things you can do. You can write a letter to the newspaper. If there's an issue, if someone cites the Goldstone report, which is a travesty of justice that excoriated Israel and exonerated Hamas, and I'm thankful that Richard Goldstone has now retracted the chief accusation of that report. Well, when people cite that report, it's important for readers of a newspaper who read that to write a letter and say, well, did you know that the Goldstone report was created by the Human Rights Council? That includes members like Saudi Arabia, China, Cuba, and Libya. Did you know that 3 of the 4 judges had written public statements saying that Israel was guilty in advance? That the report is a manifestation of extreme double standards, gives Hamas a free pass, gives Iran is not mentioned at all. So letters to the editor are important. I think people also need to lobby their members of parliament, their president, their members of Congress, their prime minister, and tell them that these issues matter to them. They can also lobby foreign diplomats and tell them that America, Canada, people are watching how those countries vote, and if those countries want to maintain goodwill in the United States, they need to vote the right way. That means they need to oppose UN resolutions, UN sessions on racism that are twisted against Israel, that hurt human rights. You know, it's a zero-sum game. If the UN is spending all its time attacking Israel, that's time directly taken away from not addressing victims in Zimbabwe, in Cuba, in Iran, in North Korea, in Syria, and across the board. And that's something people don't recognize. So if you care about human rights anywhere, then the countries ought to be voting against these initiatives. So people can use an array of initiatives. Certainly there's new media, there's Facebook pages people can create, and be persistent. We found in our work that we say the truth, and you never know after a couple of years when you get a result where the UN Secretary General condemned Richard Falk, the expert on Palestine, because he's a supporter of the 9/11 conspiracy theory. We pushed that for 3 years. Finally, something clicked, and the UN chief condemned him. So my message is be persistent, stay with the truth, believe in your truth, and don't give up.
Hillel Neuer, what a pleasure it is to speak with you. We are lucky to have you at UN Watch. You are doing a service not simply for the Jewish community, but really for all human beings of goodwill. And I thank you very much for giving us some time. Hillel Neuer, thank you, my friend.
My pleasure.